Hi, hello, and welcome to Shankar IAS Academy's daily current affairs analysis. And today's date is 8/1 and 2026. With this, let's move into the topics of the day and identify what is important and how it is important for the UPSC perspective. The first is about a global disease outbreak map, and this shows a correlation between the coping capacity of one particular region and how the disease outbreak is scheduled and how we can use technology to combat it. The second is about the significant step wells in India in various parts and how it is called and why it is significant. The third is about a biowarfare, how AI can generate biowar using viruses and threaten our biosecurity. The fourth is about India's growth story. We know that India has surpassed Japan to be the fourth largest economy, but is this the ground reality? And the fifth topic of the day is the prelims focus. With this, we also have a new announcement, that is the pre-storming test series of UPSC prelims is there. We have about 46 integrated tests, subject-wise and full tests that would aid your preparation. It starts on 20th Jan 2026 and the admissions are open now. Please check our portal and help yourself to crack this prelims. We also hope to be a part of your journey. And please like, comment, share and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Today's first topic of the day is about a global risk map. And when we talk about diseases, all of us think that most of the diseases originate in hospitals. But this fact is utterly false, because most of the diseases are transmitted from animals to humans. And this risk map shows that about 9.3% of the world's land is under risk, and the risk is of zoonotic diseases. Here you can see the map, and about 9.3% of land is under risk zone. Now let's move into it and dive in about the high risk, the low risk, the medium risk, and what are the factors that is important in the UPSC perspective. So the core findings first, about 9.3% of the Earth's land is classified as high or very high risk for dangerous diseases. So high risk is about 6.3% and very high risk is about 3%. And now we talk about the hotspot regions. We have two hotspot regions. One is Latin America and the other one is Oceania. And when we come to the population exposure, see, about 20% of the global population is present in the medium risk zone, and about 3% approximately is present in high or very high risk zone. Here, when we see 6.3 and 3%, the total population range is 3%. When we take the medium risk zone, the total population range is approximately 20%. Now the institution and methodology. The lead institution is the European Commission, and the European Commission's Joint Research Center, and the lead researcher is Anjanella Fennelly. So she is a veterinary epidemiologist, because we are talking about zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases are diseases that are transmitted from animals to humans. Now when we talk about this, she used a technique called as predictive epidemiology. Predictive epidemiology. And what is this predictive epidemiology? We have the answer in the same slide. The usage of tools like machine learning models and satellite imagery. Using machines and satellite imagery is predictive epidemiology. They actually predict the outbreaks based on this particular tool. And then the others are the climate data sets that we see, the land use maps. So this shows the land use maps and the climate data sets. Both of them show the spatial distribution if we analyze in that particular parameter. We also have GIS based systems, mapping systems to analyze both of this, and historical outbreak data. When we see how this particular disease has been in the past and how is it in the present, we see a correlation. And now when we talk about polio or some diseases, we know that, first it was Spain, it was in Pakistan, Afghanistan, India and Nigeria. Now then it became pan, and now it is only in two countries, then it is in only one country. So we can see that there is a shift from one particular realm to another particular realm. This can be seen here. So we have seen that when we use machine learning model in satellite imagery, it is predictive epidemiology, and when we use climate data set and land use maps, we see the spatial distribution, and historical outbreak data helps us compare. So with that, we are talking about zoonotic diseases. So I've mentioned what zoonotic diseases is earlier. Now 75%, almost 3/4 of the infectious diseases in humans are zoonotic. Now you see there are tripartite reports. Tri here itself means 3. The tripartite reports come from WHO, FAO and UNEP. So 3, WHO, FAO and UNEP. The zoonotic diseases involve animal to human spillover. The spillover risk will increase with wildlife contact. Here we can take the case of COVID-19. We all know we were all testaments to COVID-19. Some of you might have been in school, some of us might have been in college, some of us might have been working. But when we talk about COVID-19, we remember one important fact, that it came from a bat. And from that, we all got the COVID-19, and it was a different strand of virus. We were having the first wave, the second wave, the third wave, and we were giving new names to it. And this COVID-19 came from wildlife to human contact. Now the habitat encroachment. Here you can give the example of the Nipah virus. Why am I talking about the Nipah virus? You see, when you talk about the Nipah virus was from a bat again, but it spread through pigs. How did this happen? So whenever there is a pig farm close to where a bat is residing, then in that case, the Nipah virus was spread in Kerala. So this was in 2018, and this was very prevalently spoken about. Then the wildlife trade. When you are transporting animals from one particular region to another particular region, and there is a shift in movement, there are a lot of places that the animal travels to, and the risk is very, very high. And then the last one is intensive livestock farming. When you have a lot of livestock at one particular place, the transmission of diseases, if it is at a high rate, then the impact also will be high. This is why when we talk about diseases, we always have a demographic correlation with it, a population correlation with it, because when the population is high, the impact is very, very high. Okay, with this we move to the next slide. WHO priority diseases. See, now WHO has a priority of diseases list. In this, there is one particular thing called as the disease X. So they don't know what the next disease is going to be. So they keep a disease X. And in this disease X, what do? When, let's say, we are in 2019, we don't know what COVID-19 is. So we find that the COVID-19 is something that is very deadly. So the disease X will be replaced by COVID-19. After COVID-19, if we find a very new disease, then that will be replaced at disease X. So disease X is something that is not yet found but has the potential to be replaced. Now we see first the priority pathogen list. First is Ebola. Ebola is a hemorrhagic fever that is present. This is the first priority. The second is a Zika virus. The Zika virus stems from mosquitoes. The third is Lassa fever. Can you guess where the Lassa fever comes from? It's from rats. The Nipah virus we have already seen, bats to pigs. And as already stated, disease X is a placeholder for unknown future pathogen. And disease X, unknown pathogen with epidemic or pandemic potential. So it should have an epidemic or a pandemic potential. See, climate change and disease spread. Now we can take a parallel here. Let's talk about colonial India. When the British were ruling India, you see that there was one particular draconian law, and the draconian law was Epidemic Act of 1897. What happened in the Epidemic Act of 1897? So, there was a Bombay plague, and the British wanted to actually control this plague, but they were not able to. So, what did they do? They created a draconian law, the Epidemic Act of 1897, and they chose to put impositions. Sometimes they would demolish a property which was infected. Sometimes they would ask the person to vacate the property. Sometimes they would say that this particular road is not accessible, and sanitary issues were there at that particular point of time. So people were getting very scared, and during this particular act is when Bala Gangadhar Tilak was imprisoned for 18 years because he called out this act and he said this is not how it should work, and this is a very draconian law. So now how is this related here? When we talk about the earlier law, earlier in the colonial times, this law was for control. And now in the present times, we see about prevention. Now, how is this related? Again, when we see a risk map now, we are judging a risk map. We are finding the high outbreak areas and the most vulnerable areas like Latin America or Oceania. But also, the important point of this research is that it also has a parallel to the capacity, the coping capacity of that particular state. It analyzes that, okay, this is the coping capacity of this particular state. So, this is how much it can take, how much risk it can take at that particular point in time. So, when we see about the climate change in the disease spread, rising temperatures alter the vector survival range, the breeding cycles and migration patterns. Now, one more important pointer here is when you talk about mosquito and tick based diseases, now you see that it is increasing in high altitude regions. That is one more point that you can talk about. Long warm seasons enable expansion of malaria, dengue, Zika into new regions. Okay. WHO and IPCC. So, if IPCC, is it a part of the tripartite expansion? Is it a part of the tripartite report? No. WHO is only part, and then the second one is the FAO, and try to remember what the third one is. WHO and IPCC have identified climate change as a health risk multiplier. Climate change and disease spread. Rising temperature, okay, this we have already seen. Land use and population density. Population density emerged as a single strongest driver of outbreak risk. So, any individual climate variable, more than that, the population is one where there is high risk. As I have already mentioned, if the population is high, the risk is also going to be high, because people are, when they are close knit, when the demography is high, the spread of the disease, the impact also might be high. The other contributing factors are deforestation. When there is deforestation, the human wildlife contact might be high. Second one is mining. It might bring in some unknown pathogen that was earlier hidden. Road constructions, the same. Biodiversity loss. So, the loss of biodiversity may favor reservoir species, that is rodent bats or something that was in the reservoir. It might come out when all four of this happen. Preparedness and global institutions. WHO, it maintains global disease surveillance that we know. HERA, Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority. So, preparedness is there, but HERA, Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority. Both of them are global institutions for preparedness for zoonotic diseases. The focus diseases are Ebola, Zika, Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, and India is a part of the global health security agenda. So now when we talk about it, we also have to understand how do we use this particular thing if we have to write it for mains. So the first is, if you are taking GS1, you can quote the predictive epidemiology in geography. the draconian law that we saw here in history. When we take the case of GS2, we can see the tripartite reporting in terms of governance angle. In GS3, we can talk about the coping capacity. In society, we can talk about the risk society, particular areas where there is risk. In ethics, we can talk about what is important, how do we conserve, and if we do conserve such a species that creates a lot of zoonotic diseases, is it right? But we have to give protection. What is the dilemma present there? That we can talk about in the ethical angle as well. And sometimes they use animals for research purposes. Sometimes it also invokes a kind of animal cruelty, the bio-war that is arising. So we can understand all these factors and we can use it in all the 4 GS papers. Now, we have come to the prelims practice question of the day. The first question, consider the following statements regarding the emerging infectious diseases. Nearly 3/4 of emerging infectious diseases in humans originate from animals. So, we saw that when it originates from animals, it's zoonotic, and 3/4 is 75%. We have seen the exact statement in the slide. So, the first statement should be right. Population density is a strong driver of outbreak risk rather than individual climate factors. Yes. WHO uses the term disease X to denote antimicrobial resistance. No, it is used to denote the future pathogen. Right? It's used to denote the future pathogen. The Joint Research Centre is the scientific arm of the European Commission. Yes. Now we know that the third statement is wrong. Where do we have 3 here? Okay, 1 is definitely right. So the answer should be A, 1, 2 and 4. Okay. So the answer is 1, 2 and 4. With this, we have come to the end of the first topic of the day. And let's move into the second topic. So we've come to the second topic of the day. Long before our modern technology evolved and long before pipelines and drains evolved, there was one particular thing that was very, very important for water conservation. That is the step well. And today we are going to see step wells in perspective of art and culture and history. And I hope that this will help you in your preparation when you give examples for your GS1 and GS4 in some angles. So let's dive into the topic. So what are step wells? Step wells are traditional water harvesting structures of India. Water harvesting structures of India. They are known by different names. So the first, Baori or Baoli. It is known in North India. Vav. Vav is present in Gujarat and Rajasthan. And Pushkarni or Kalyani is in South India. Pushkarni or Kalyani is in South India. Next slide. It is designed to access groundwater year round. So the groundwater is present here the whole year round it's present here to mitigate arid and semi-arid climate conditions. So this also functioned as social spaces. You can use this in GS1, ritual and religious centers. So you can always say that this gave a concept of collectivism, and this was a form of inclusivity, and it was also a resting place for travelers. So social space, a resting space for travelers, and it also gave a point of collectivism and inclusivity, the 3 uses of it. Now we are moving to the step wells of India. This is the first step well that we are going to see about. This is the Chand Baoli. This is the first step well. You see there are tiny steps here, and there are about 3,500 steps in this step well, and this is where the groundwater is present. Now let's move into it and identify what are the important facts that we have to remember. So first, this Chand Bauri is present in Rajasthan. Abneri in Rajasthan. The period is 9th century CE. The dynasty is the Nikum dynasty and King Chanda. King Chanda was the one who built this particular step well, and he belonged to the Nikum dynasty. If you want to remember this in such a way, you remember the name. This is the name of Amir Khan in Tare Zameen Par movie. So Nikum dynasty, King Chanda. The key facts is that it's among the deepest step wells in India, about 30 meters. There were 13 stories and 3,500 symmetrical steps. One important thing to remember here is a microclimate engineering. What is this microclimate engineering technique? That is, the microclimate engineering technique shows that when you compare the temperature outside Rajasthan, here when you come and move inside the step well, it is about 5 degree to 6 degrees lesser. So this was a natural AC for them. So this microclimate engineering technique made them feel very comfortable inside the step well. So this was one important point that we have to remember when we talk about an arid region like Rajasthan. This was one of the reasons why this is spoken about even today. And the next is, it had a lot of water conservation ideals, but we are going to talk about the present context. In the present context, there is a mismatch. What is the mismatch? Earlier, this was used for conservation, and today, even though we have heritage, this cannot be used. There's no point of usage. So in policy making, we have to address how to, revive this and use step wells even in the present day context. So this is about Chand Bauri in Rajasthan. The second step well, the Mata Bhavani step well. The Mata Bhavani step well, this is present in the Gujarat region. This is named after Mata Bhavani. It's in Ahmedabad in Gujarat. Earlier, when we saw about Chand Bauri, it was in 9th century. This is in 11th century CE. That was in the Nikum dynasty by King Chanda. This was in the Solanki period. So the key facts are that it is dedicated to goddess Bhavani. It is an early example of ritual and water utility. The simpler architecture compared to later Vavs. So Vav, you know that in Gujarat, the step wells were called as Vavs. I'll give you an interesting take in the society perspective. So when we talk about the medieval India, we talk about one important thing that, women were not given a lot of importance. But when we talk about water, water is always associated to the female space. So these step wells or these Vavs, they were always gendered spaces. That is, women had access to this space. They saw this as a space to meet each other and share and talk about things. So this is very, very important to remember that when you in sociology or in social angle, these were gendered spaces where women could meet and they could talk about things. So again, this is in Gujarat. The next is that this step well was the early evolution of step well in Western India, because usually it wasn't in Western India. Next is the Adlet step well of Gujarat. So you see, this is a very beautiful step well when you look at it, and there is a mythical story or maybe a real life story, but it's told whenever you think about the Adlet step well. So it is told that there was a Rani and there was a king. So when the king came, when the invading king came in, he killed the husband of the Rani and he asked her to marry him. So the Rani told, there's a construction of a step well, and once you finish the construction of the step well, maybe I will think about marrying you. And once the stepwell construction was completed, she was very satisfied that my subjects will not go without water and they will have access to water. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to jump into the stepwell and commit Jal Jauhar. So this is told to be an example of Jal Jauhar, like how people like jump into fire. There are certain people who jump into water to save their dignity. So this is one important perspective that is seen. Now, the Adlet Stepwell in Gujarat is near Ahmedabad. The year of construction is 1499 CE. This was by Queen Rudrabai. The architectural significance is that it has 5 stories. It's a blend of Hindu and Islamic architecture. So now here you see cultural syncretism. So this shows one important point, that the cultural syncretism was not just in temples or mosques, but this was also present in architectures, which is very, very important for the livelihood of people, like in this case, the stepwells. So this showed Hindu and Islamic elements, a bridge of that, and the functional aspect is the air circulation, the cooling effect, and the water filtration system, which was present here. So because of the mythical story that we see here, a lot of times, a lot of people actually feel that the Adlet stepwell is of great significance. The next is Agarsen Ki Baoli in Delhi. This is the stepwell in Delhi. You see here, this is how you lead to the groundwater. It's a beautiful stepwell, and this is near Connaught Place, and it is built in the medieval era, but it is told that it was built during the Lodi or the Tughlaq dynasty, and it has an association with Maharaja Agarsen. And the key features are, it is 60 meters long, it has 3 levels. The earlier one had 5 stories. This is arched niche on both sides. You see the arched niche, arched niche. It is on both sides. On the to my left and to my right, I have arched niches. And the unique aspect is, this is a rare urban stepwell in a modern metropolis. This is a rare urban stepwell which is seen in the modern metropolis area. So with this, we move to the final stepwell. If you have a 50 rupees note in your hand, you would have seen this stepwell again and again. What is it? It is the Rani Ki Vav. The Rani Ki Vav is a beautiful stepwell, and this also has a story. This was a commemoration of the Queen Udayamati for her king Bhimdev. King Bhimdev I. So Bhimdev I, after he died, this queen wanted to commemorate, but she didn't want to build a sculpture of her husband. She wanted to feel something even more sacred that people will use, and something that will go deep into the ground and will be remembered forever. That is the Rani Ki Vav, and it is built in the name of King Bhimdev, and the patron is Queen Udayamati. This is also from the Solanki dynasty. This is present in Gujarat in 11th century CE. UNESCO status is that it was declared a World Heritage Site in 2014. But this was a inverted temple which was muddled, and it did not come out. It was muddled. So the key features are, it is designed as an inverted, reversed temple. It had 7 levels, over 1,500 sculptures. It had a strong Vaishnavite iconography, and because Vaishnavas were considered as the preservers, he was considered as the preserver and the protector, which is why it had a lot of Vaishnavite iconography. And when the preservation was buried under silt. What is silt? Basically the debris, mud debris from the Saraswati river flooding. It was rediscovered in the 20th century. Until then, this step well was buried underneath. Only after that, it was rediscovered. So the Rani Ki, we have seen the significance of Rani Ki Vav, and this is one of the most important pointers when it comes to World Heritage Sites. So with that, we come to the prelims practice question of the day. Consider the following statements with reference to stepwells in India. Rani Ki Vav is designed as an inverted temple and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Yes, we saw in the slide in the year 2014. So the first statement should be right. Chand Bauri was built during the Mughal period and is located in Gujarat. Chand Bauri was not built during the Mughal period, and we know that it was built by the Nikum dynasty by King Chanda. So which of the following statements given above are right? We know this is wrong. 2, 2, 2. It should be 1 only. Let's check if our answer is right. So yes, the answer is 1 only. With this, we have come to the end of the second topic and we have discussed some beautiful step wells. Now we are moving to the third topic of the day, which talks about how AI has been used in something very, very new. And let's move into that topic. The next topic of the day is about a biowar. A biowar that could possibly be designed by AI. Today, we are in a generation where technology is accessible to each and every one of us. And when AI can create a lot of genomes, pathogens, and ideologies for something as serious as this, we are bound to analyze its pros, its cons, and the preventive measures that are already present and the policy changes that need to be done. So let's move into this topic. AI designed viruses and biosecurity. AI can now create viruses from scratch, one step away from the perfect biological weapon, as already stated. The first slide is about AI and its virus creation. What is in the news? So, artificial intelligence is used to create proper viral genomes, and viruses created in studies are bacteriophages. So, what are bacteriophages? Bacteriophages are basically viruses that multiply itself inside a bacteria, that are bacteriophages. And these bacteriophages do not harm humans in any point. They only infect the bacteria. This research highlights biosecurity risk of advanced AI tools. Study published was in Science Advances, the journal. Okay. So with this, we move to bacteriophages and its key fact. So viruses that specifically infect bacteria. Viruses that specifically infect bacteria is the bacteriophage, and they do not infect human cells as already seen in the previous slide, and it's used in phage therapy. So what is this phage therapy? Phage therapy basically means usage of bacteriophages in treatment. Next, we all know biological technology, use of bacteriophages in biotechnology, then antimicrobial resistance research. They use this for the research. It is recognized by WHO as a potential antimicrobial research solution. So, this is the key pointer here. Next is AI technology used. Genome language models. See, when we talk about ChatGPT, Gemini, DeepSeek, Claude, or any AI, the AI is trained using data. And when we talk about a lot of things, it is data for it to train itself. That is how large language models, LLM, that's how it works. Now, in this case, the genome language models, they're trained on large DNA sequence data sets, and they're capable of designing new but functional genomes. New genomes, this AI can create new genomes, but it can be functional, it can be bought in real life. So this generating proteins are similar to the natural viruses, henceforth the data set when it is high let's say that they have this AI model has about 1 lakh DNA, and then it's processing and it's able to create a new virus that could infect all of us. It will be the next pandemic, the next disease X, as we have already seen. So this is the danger. The dual use research concern, it can be used for beneficial purpose or harmful purpose. So just as we told, technology can be a boon or bane. This can be beneficial or this can be harmful as well. So AI driven biological design are classified as dual use. It's identified by WHO and National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity. Next, DNA synthesis screening risks. DNA synthesis companies screen genetic sequences and customer identities. Let's say that I'm able to code my DNA into one of you and say that you belong to my family. What kind of a risk would it pose? So it's very, very risky and can redesign toxins to evade traditional sequence based screening. So when I'm screening it, it can look like something that is helpful for the community, but it can have a dangerous virus like nature, but I cannot see it when I actually evade it and when I actually screen it. So it is very, very differential. Here, I would like to quote the case which happened during the colonial era. So when the British was fighting the Native Americans, they did not use bullets. They did not use any kind of weapon. They just gave bed sheets. But you know what the bed sheets had? It had smallpox. The people who already had smallpox used those bed sheets, and those were given to the Native Americans, and that's how they won the war. It was a bio war. It started even in the colonial period. And when this can avail traditional sequences based screening and they can change their protein structure, that kind of bio war can happen even today. And that's why it's very, very alarming. And the new screening methods include protein structure and protein function. Global biosecurity mechanisms, International Gene Synthesis Consortium, in industrial-led screening standards. Okay, the standards are industrial-led. They have harmonized protocols, meaning if there is one unit here, there is a bridge between all three units, and all three units have a harmonized way and synchronized way wherein they identify what happens. International Biosecurity and Biosafety Initiative. So what is the difference between biosecurity and biosafety? Here you have to use the word intentional. In case there is intentional or malicious misuse, then in that case it's biosecurity and we are going to stop that. And biosafety is basically a preventive measure. So the global coordination is there on the screening norms, whatever we are going to do. WHO maintains a priority pathogen list, as we have already seen the Zika, the Ebola, and other pathogen lists and other diseases list, and there's also a disease X category, as we have already seen. The next is about the key takeaways. AI created viruses currently are limited to simple viruses. Engineering human pathogens still requires high containment labs and long experimentation. So now if there is an access to this in the upcoming future, then it's going to be very, very difficult for us to stop AI induced biowar coming. And biosecurity is not equal to biosafety. As already stated, biosecurity is misuse prevention, and the misuse should be intentional, and biosafety is accidental exposure prevention. Consider the following statements. Bacteriophages are viruses that infect bacteria and are being explored for treating antibiotic resistant infections. The dual use research and explored for treating antibiotic resistance. Dual use research refers to the scientific work that has both beneficial and potentially harmful applications. Yes. Yes. So this, both statements are right. Which of the following statements given above are correct? Both 1 and 2. Yes, the answer is both 1 and 2. With this, we have come to the end of the third prelims topic of the day, and we are going to move to the mains topic of the day. So we have come to the mains topic of the day. There is always a mismatch between ground reality and what truly happens. And in this case, we have denoted ourselves to be the fourth largest economy in the world, that we've surpassed Japan. But is this true? Is this a ground reality? And what is the tiny correlation between Japan and India's per capita? Let's dive deep into it. So, as India claims fourth largest economy spot, what it means on the ground? That's what we are going to see about. Macroeconomic milestones. GDP valuation. India's economy is valued at 4.18 trillion, placing it fourth globally, ahead of Japan, behind the US, China, and Germany. So this is based on the GDP. Now, based on the growth rate, it said that the real GDP grew 8.2% in the second quarter of the financial year 2025-26, a 6-quarter high, indicating resilience amid global trade uncertainties. The future projection is that India is projected to overtake Germany by 2030, becoming the third largest economy with an estimated GDP of 7.3 trillion. So this is what is the statistical data with GDP, with growth rate and future projection. The future projection is that it will overtake Germany by 2030. The growth rate is that the real GDP grew by 8.2% in the second quarter, and the GDP value is that we are ahead of Japan, but still beyond US, China and Germany. So supporting economic indicators, what supports this? The inflation indicator, the consumer price index hit a record low in 2025, attributed to price management and GST rationalization. In employment angle, the employment fell to a 4.8% with higher labor force participation. The sectors are manufacturing and services sector, so balanced growth, and the infrastructure and digital angles that highways have crossed about 1,46,000 kilometers, and the UPI transactions, sorry, it's not UPSC, and the UPI transactions grew by 9 times. So these are some of the economic factors that support it. So the first one is inflation, the second one is employment, and the third one is sectors. Manufacturing sectors by 9%, services sector by 9.3%, and infrastructure and digital ways where highways crossed 1,46,000 kilometers and UPSC transactions rose 9 times. But the reality, this is where the check comes in, the per capita income. Japanese citizens are 12 times more richer. That is, the Japan's per capita income is 12 times more than India's per capita income, explaining why our growth feels invisible. Even though we have done so much achievement, this is why it feels invisible. And India's per capita is only $2,900 to $3,000. Now the inflation trap, the current inflation is low, but cumulatively when you think sector by sector, there is a price rise. In food, in fuel, they are permanently raised living costs, because food is something we cannot live without, and fuel is something that is very, very significant in today's gen. So this is something that has caused something very, very alarming in regard to the inflationary aspect. Now, two-speed K-shaped economy. Imagine a K. Imagine this is the sector 1. Imagine this is the sector 2. So the first sector has a upskill growth like this. The second sector goes down. So India is a K-shaped economy where one sector goes up and one sector goes down. And the organized sector, finance, IT, MNCs enjoy strong growth and salary hikes. Whereas the unorganized sector, which constitutes about the 93 to 94%, faces job insecurity and stagnant incomes. So even though we have high GDP, there is stagnant growth, and this isn't creating enough quality jobs. How many of us know at least one person who is overqualified for the job that they are doing? And that is one of the major risks, the job security that happens. Many graduates are underemployed in low paying gig work. Gig work is on the rise. So a lot of people are enrolling themselves in Zepto, Zomato, Swiggy, Blinkit, Instamart, and they are in the quick commerce realm, and it is easily accessible. So many graduates are underemployed. Bridging the gap. So a lot of schemes that our Prime Minister has brought brought in to bridge the gap between the job security issue. The first one is the PM Vishwakarma scheme, that is skill training is given and rupees 500 per day is given as stipend, and a 15,000 rupees toolkit support and collateral free loan is given at 5%. The next is Skill India Mission 2.0. It focuses on new age skills like AI, robotics, drones for organized sector jobs and small traders and street vendors. Next is the PM Swanidhi scheme, SVANIDHI. Okay, so this is in capital and the ED. So working capital loans for 15,000 to 50,000, 7% interest subsidy, and UPI cashback is given in this particular scheme. And the PM Mudra Yojana, the collateral free loans up to 20 lakh rupees for small non-farmer business. eShram portal. This is a national database for informal workers, enabling insurance, crisis support and DBT. Atal Pension Yojana, where we are guaranteeing 1,000 to 5,000 rupees monthly pension after the age of 60. Ayushman Bharat PMJ, 5 lakh health cover per family annually. Rural women entrepreneurs, Lakpati Didi or Namo Drone Didi, they are self-help group women who are trained for technology-based livelihood targeting 1 lakh plus income. PM Jan Dhan Yojana, universal bank account coverage for direct subsidy transfers. So these are some, earlier we saw some of the government's bridging gap initiatives with artisans and skilled workers. And now we have seen social security and safety nets that we have. With this, we come to the mains practice question. India's rise to the position of world's fourth largest economy masks significant ground level challenges critically examined. So please send us across your answer copies for this question and we'll help you aid yourself in this preparation. With this, we'll be moving to the prelims focus for the day, which is the fifth and the final topic. So we have come to the prelims focus of the day, and the first topic is Abhyuday 3. Why the 3 is there? Because it's a third technical Hindi symposium, that is Takni Hindi Sangoshti. It is organized at the IIT, Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Indore. It is jointly organized by 3 other IITs. One is IIT Indore, the other is IIT Jodhpur, and the CSIR, National Institute of Science and Communication and Policy Research, CSIR, NIS, CPR. So the aim is to promote the use of technical Hindi and to strengthen the outreach of science and technology to wider sections of the society. Basically, it's to promote Hindi. This is Abhyuday 3. The next is the Goldilocks economy. Goldilocks, the word Goldilocks itself features one important thing, that is, it is an ideal zone. It has balanced growth, it has low inflation, it has full employment, and it avoids recession and overheating. It is investment friendly. So as I already mentioned, the ideal condition, it is a very utopian space wherein there are stable conditions to boost equities and corporate growth. It is very, very short lived. The business cycles make it very, very temporary, and the policy requirement is that it needs monetary and fiscal management to sustain itself. So W Ursae Majoris, it's a short period, very, very important, it's a short period contract binary orbiting. So it is an orbiting star. See, stars share outer space atmosphere while orbiting each other. This is dumbbell shaped. This star is dumbbell shaped because it has mutual contact, and it acts as a national laboratory for measuring mass, radius and temperature. So it helps test and refine stellar evolution theories. So these theories can be identified based on this. This is the dumbbell shaped Ursae Majoris. You can see that it is connected here. Prelims practice question: which of the following statements about W Ursae Majoris stars is or are correct? They are contact binary stars sharing a common outer atmosphere. They have short orbital periods. They provide precise measurements of stellar parameters like mass, radius, and useful for testing stellar evolution theories, right? So the option should be 2 only because statement 2 is wrong. Let's check the answer. Yes, the answer is 2 only. With this, we have come to the end of the prelims focus of the day. I hope all the other topics were useful to you and you've gained something out of it. And I hope you like this video. Thank you for watching.